Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, only to find yourself trapped in your own body, unable to move, speak, or even scream for help? The world around you feels like it's frozen in time, and the more you try to break free, the more impossible it seems. You try to call out for help, but your voice doesn't work. The fear grows, the dread becomes palpable, and yet you're powerless. This is the terrifying reality of sleep paralysis, a phenomenon that has haunted countless people around the world. For some, it's a fleeting moment of terror, but for others, it's a horrifying experience that lingers long after the paralysis has lifted. Tonight, I'll tell you the chilling story of a woman who experienced sleep paralysis in its most terrifying form. She thought she understood it at first, but what she faced that night wasn't just a physical condition. It was something far darker, something that blurred the line between nightmare and reality. Are you ready? Take a deep breath and let's dive into the story. It was a night like any other when Emily first encountered sleep paralysis. She had just moved into a small, quiet apartment in the city, far from the noise and bustle of her old neighborhood. She was in her late 20s, ambitious and independent, always focused on her work. She had spent the last few months setting up her new life and was looking forward to a peaceful night of sleep. But that night, things would be different. Emily had worked late again, as usual. She was exhausted and barely able to keep her eyes open by the time she arrived home. The clock on her wall read 11:45 p.m. when she finally climbed into bed. Her mind was racing with thoughts of the day's events, but exhaustion quickly overtook her, and within minutes, she drifted into a deep sleep. Hours passed, and suddenly, she was awake. She didn't know how long she had been asleep, but the feeling of waking up felt strange. She opened her eyes, but everything around her seemed distorted. The room looked normal, yet it felt completely off. The air was thick, and the silence in the room felt almost suffocating. She could feel the weight of her body pressed into the mattress, and as she tried to move, she realized something was wrong. She couldn't move. Her limbs felt paralyzed, and despite how hard she tried to move her arms, legs, or even shift her position, her body wouldn't obey. It was as if her mind was awake, but her body was still trapped in a deep, immovable slumber. Panic began to rise within her, but there was more. A strange, unsettling presence filled the room. It was hard to explain, but she could feel it. Something was there with her. The sensation was overwhelming, as though an invisible weight had been placed on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She tried to call out, to scream for help, but her voice wouldn't work. There was no sound, no movement. She could feel her heart racing, and sweat started to form on her forehead. The darkness of the room seemed to close in on her, and despite the weight in her chest, she somehow felt cold. She tried to focus, trying to make sense of what was happening. It's just sleep paralysis, she thought. People go through this all the time. It's just a trick of the mind. But deep inside, she knew something wasn't right. Something felt off, something far beyond the natural explanation. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Emily thought she saw a shadow move at the edge of her vision. It wasn't clear, but there was definitely something there. A figure, standing just outside the reach of her bed, watching her. She tried to focus on it, but the more she tried to look, the more it seemed to fade away, vanishing into the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it just her imagination? Or was something really in the room with her? The paralysis didn't ease. It felt as though time itself was frozen. The more she struggled, the more impossible it seemed to move. It was like she was caught in a nightmare where everything was real, but none of it made sense. She was trapped, unable to do anything, and the presence in the room only grew stronger. And then she heard it, a low whisper coming from the darkness. It was so faint at first that she couldn't make out the words, but as the seconds passed, the whispering grew louder. The voice was familiar, but distorted, almost unrecognizable. It wasn't just any voice. It was a deep, guttural tone, one that sent chills down her spine. The whispering circled around her, moving from one side of the bed to the other. Emily tried to scream, to fight against the invisible force that held her down, but nothing happened. The words were becoming clearer now, but they didn't make sense. They were a language she couldn't understand, a language that felt ancient and foreboding. Her heart pounded faster in her chest as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. She could see her breath in the air now, even though the room was warm. The darkness felt heavier, as though it was pressing against her, suffocating her with its coldness. It wasn't just a physical chill, it was a deep, unsettling chill that seeped into her bones. The voice grew louder, now right in her ear. She could feel its presence next to her, as though someone was standing right beside her, whispering into her ear. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The figure she had seen earlier in the corner of her vision seemed to reappear. Only this time it was closer. Emily could barely comprehend what was happening. The whispers were getting more intense, and the figure now seemed to take form. It wasn't human. It was tall, towering over her in the dark. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its form shifting like smoke. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her, drilling into her soul. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, Emily thought she might be able to move, to escape. But before she could react, the figure took a step forward, its presence looming over her. And then, everything went black. Emily's eyes snapped open once again, but this time she wasn't in her bed. For a moment, everything felt distant and disconnected, like she was floating in a void. Her body felt weightless, but her mind was fully alert. It was as though she was being pulled in every direction at once, and she struggled to regain control. She tried to move her fingers, her hands, anything, but once again, she was paralyzed. The darkness around her felt suffocating, and she realized that the suffocating presence from before was still there. She could feel it, lurking just beyond her reach. Panic set in once again, but this time, she knew she was in for something far worse than she had anticipated. This wasn't just sleep paralysis anymore. It was something far darker. It was something that wasn't bound by the natural laws of the world. She tried to breathe through the fear. "This isn't real," she told herself. "It's just my mind playing tricks on me. Just sleep paralysis." But then the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, more distinct, and far more sinister. It was the same voice she had heard before, but now it wasn't speaking in a foreign language. The words it spoke were clear, and each one sent a tremor through her spine. They were dark, chilling, and ancient words that didn't belong in this world. As she lay there, frozen, the figure, still cloaked in shadows, moved toward her once again. She could feel its presence, the air thickening with its malevolent energy. It was so close now, standing at the edge of her bed, so near that she could almost reach out and touch it. But she couldn't move. The shadow shifted, and a form emerged from it. Emily tried to look, to see what was taking shape, but it was like trying to focus on something that constantly moved just out of view. She could only make out its silhouette, tall, thin, and unnaturally elongated. Its limbs stretched in ways that no human could, bending and twisting at impossible angles. Emily's heart raced, but her body remained still, as if paralyzed by fear itself. She tried to scream again, but once more, no sound escaped her lips. Then, the figure leaned down. It hovered over her, its face inches from hers, but there was no face to see. Only darkness, a void where a face should have been. It whispered directly into her ear, and this time, the words were unmistakable. "You can't escape. You belong to me." A cold shiver ran through her as the whisper felt like it was digging into her mind. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly powerless. The air felt thick with dread, as though the very essence of fear had taken physical form in the room. Suddenly, the figure stepped back, and the pressure on her chest lessened. Emily gasped for air, desperate for a breath, but as she did, something even worse happened. The room around her began to warp, bending and twisting in impossible ways. The walls stretched and contracted, and the floor beneath her seemed to ripple like water. She was no longer in her bedroom. She didn't know where she was, but it was dark. Too dark. The surroundings were alien, unfamiliar, and the oppressive presence was still there, closing in on her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and seemed to come from every direction at once. Emily could barely make sense of the voices, but they were unmistakably speaking to her, circling her thoughts. "Leave me alone," Emily thought, trying desperately to break free of the paralysis. But there was no escape. With all the strength she could muster, she forced herself to concentrate, to focus on anything that might break the hold this entity had on her. "It's just my mind," she kept repeating to herself. "Just my mind." But even as she repeated the mantra, she felt a heavy force press down on her chest again. The darkness in the room seemed to grow thicker, colder, as though it was physically closing in around her. She could barely breathe as it seemed to crush her with its weight. And then, in a flash, everything went still. The whispers ceased, the darkness receded, and the weight lifted from her chest. Emily opened her eyes again, and this time, the room was normal. She was back in her bed, the familiar surroundings of her apartment once again visible. Her body was no longer paralyzed. She could move her arms, her legs. She sat up, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. Her skin was cold with sweat, and she was shaking uncontrollably. She wasn't sure if it was all a nightmare or if what she had just experienced was something far more sinister. The feeling of dread lingered, and though the darkness was gone, Emily knew it wasn't over. Whatever had visited her in that moment was still there, waiting. As she sat in bed, trying to calm her racing heart, she heard something, a faint whisper. It wasn't from the room, but from deep within her mind. It was soft, barely audible, but the words were clear. "Sleep. You can't hide from me." And just like that, Emily knew that sleep would never be the same again. Every night, she wondered if she would face the entity again, if the paralysis would return, if the whispers would haunt her once more. And that question, was it real, or was it just her mind playing tricks, remained unanswered. All Emily knew was that the darkness, the whispers, and the terror were far from over. She would be forever haunted by that one night, where the line between nightmare and reality blurred, and she was left to wonder whether she was truly alone when she slept. Conclusion. Sleep paralysis is something that many people experience at some point in their lives, but Emily's story is just one example of how terrifying and real it can feel when you're trapped in your own mind. It's a phenomenon that has been reported by people all over the world, and while science has some explanations, it still leaves so many questions unanswered. The fear of not knowing what's real and what's imagined, and the terror of feeling completely helpless in your own body, is something that can stay with you long after the experience is over. But remember, no matter how dark or terrifying the experience may seem, you're never truly alone. There's always a way out, whether through facing your fears or simply waking up. And if you've ever had your own experience with sleep paralysis, remember, you're not alone. Share your story with others, and together we can understand the mystery that lurks in the darkness of our minds.